So what is the case if you radically transform your diet and you go 100% whole food plant-based all at once? You will be miserable. And the reason why is
Dr. Bulsiewicz is a board certified in internal medicine and gastroenterology, and also a New York Times best-selling author of Fibre Fuelled. I think it's quite an unexplained area. Can you first explain what is SIBO?
SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. This is something that, first of all, it's real, but also
Lots of people get worried about IBS. What do you say to those people that are listening that might struggle to have fiber?
to be clear, impossible to cure, but if you put it into remission where you are no longer having symptoms, get the treatment that they need, breaking that chain, and that is a rocket ship. You watch that person fly and it is the most beautiful and exciting thing, and you're like, this is incredible.
So much of this conversation has actually been, don't fear that food, which I think is a really important take-home message.
Completely agree. And I'm not advocating that people inflict harm on their body and be in crippling pain. See, I have tremendous sympathy for this, and 10 years ago I was in that place myself. No matter where you are today, there is the opportunity that exists to have a better tomorrow. What I believe is
I'm your host, Sarah Ann Macklin, and I'm on a mission to uncover the maze of health myths around nutrition and well-being and guide you through my 7 pillars of health. Join me on a journey of discovery and connection, and pull up a pew for a front row seat to the most exclusive health conversations of our time. Welcome to Live Well, Be Well. If you've watched one episode and enjoyed it, I'd love to ask in agreement for you to subscribe to the show. Subscribing is such a small thing, but gives so much exposure, bringing bigger guests, bigger production, and more that we can deliver each week to more people. Every time you subscribe, it shows me that you enjoy the content. So if you do me a favor, and if you've enjoyed the show, please press subscribe. Dr. Bulsiewicz, welcome back to Live Well, Be Well. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Sarah Ann. Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm so happy we're doing this. And next time I want to be able to do it in person. But our last conversation was probably about 8 months ago. And it was, I think, one of our most highly listened episodes. And we had so many questions from that. So I'm going to just dive straight on in on this.
Let's do it.
So last time you spoke on the show and you said something quite significant that a few people picked up on that I wanted to start with. So you spoke a lot about the gut barrier. And I think when we think about gut health, we think a lot about the gut microbiome, and we maybe less think about the gut barrier. And you mentioned that every 4 to 6 days, you can have a brand new layer of cells around your gut barrier. And that's really important to, one, reduce inflammation. And we know how important inflammation is to keep down because it drives disease. So I wanted to start in this place, actually, around the gut barrier. And I wondered if you could outline what are the most important factors to keep a gut barrier healthy.
Okay, so let's pretend for a moment that we have a microscope. And so we're going to use that microscope to zoom in on this part of our body that exists. It's completely alive right now. Things are happening in this place, and we just can't see them. Like, it's almost conceptually similar to, like, if you're up in an airplane, you would look down on the Earth and you would just see a big dome, a big planet, and you wouldn't know that there's people down there living their lives. Right now, there's microbes down there living their lives. We're going to zoom in with the microscope, and what we see is this community of microorganisms, our microbiome, and they're hard at work. And much like, they're quite similar to our world in many ways. They have, like, each microbe has different skills, different things that they do well. They have different temperaments. Some are very nice, very supportive. Some are a bit nasty. They have different friends. So they run in cliques in a way. Like, there's certain people that they hang out with that are similar, and they do things together. And they have different dietary preferences. So, like, they don't all like the same thing. And this is where the concept of dietary diversity comes in. All right. So now these microbes, one of the things that they're hard at work doing is helping to support and nurture the gut the gut barrier. And the gut barrier is a single layer of cells that separates what's happening inside your intestine from your immune system. 70% of your immune system is immediately on the other side of that gut barrier, and your bloodstream. And if you can get access to the bloodstream, then you can pump whatever it is that you just put into the blood. You can pump that to the brain and other parts of the body in seconds. So these are highly vital, highly important parts of our body. We just don't think about them because like they're largely, microscopic and quite small. So now this gut barrier, it's constantly being revised, constantly being rebuilt. And part of it is the workers who are gut microbes, hard at work, building it. But on the flip side, there are the disruptors, the bad guys, who they don't like the gut barrier. If anything, they want to smash through that gut barrier, mess up your immune system, basically meaning create inflammation, get access to your bloodstream and put things into those bloodstream that are going to make you sick, like bacterial endotoxin. And so those disruptors, they exist, like E. coli, they're there. But provided we have enough good guys, the bad guys just aren't really able to do much. The problem that exists in 2024, Sarah Ann, is that we're not properly supporting the good guys. And in some ways, we're actually like not even realizing what we're doing. We're actually supporting the bad guys. And so it creates an imbalance between the microbes. And this is the first step towards disrupting the gut barrier, which is that the gut barrier is actually highly dependent on these microbes. And the balance of microbes determines the ability of the gut barrier to remain intact and serve its purpose. So what are some actually very direct examples of how this works? The number one, I don't care what people say on the internet. By far, in the science, the number one factor is fiber. Fiber and resistant starches, because that fiber and resistant starch passes through the intestines unchanged. We as humans don't have the enzymes to break it down, which means it's intact. It arrives intact to the colon. The microbes come into contact with it, and they have the enzymes. And they will apply those enzymes, working in teams, their little clique of friends, unpack that fiber or that resistant starch, releasing butyrate or acetate or propionate, these short-chain fatty acids. And specifically butyrate is the one that creates the cement that holds the building blocks of the gut barrier together. And this becomes the key. And so here we are, and in the United States, 95%, I always say this, 95% of Americans are deficient in fiber, 90% in the UK.
Wow. So what foods are high in butyrate? If people are thinking, okay, if I'm having fibrous foods, what are the ones that are going to have these certain type of properties that release these short chain fatty acids that can help basically restore my gut barrier? Because what's quite also hopeful about this conversation is what I mentioned at the beginning. Every 4 to 6 days, there's a new turnover. So we can do something about this quite actively and quite quickly. So what food should we be looking at to help support that?
Yeah, 100%. And these microbes are turning over 20 minutes. So the gut barrier may be several days, but the gut microbes, a new generation, is being spawned potentially every 20 minutes.
Wow.
So
that quick.
Yeah. And if you were to look at that over the course of a day and try to translate that into human years, because for example, a human, it takes us on average 20 to 30 years to create a new generation. So they're doing it in 20 minutes. So if you were to do that over the course of a day, we could go back to the time of the pyramids. We would be before Christ in 24 hours. That's how many generations are being spawned on a daily basis. So this is where we have clear evidence that the choices that we make today by tomorrow will be reflected in your gut microbiome. Not some massive overhaul. You have one good meal, that doesn't mean you've completely changed your gut microbiome. But what is happening is that the change is underway. You are starting to spawn the microbes that thrive. So the question was, what foods can we eat? And the beautiful and exciting thing about this is that we could try to get super technical. I've seen lists where people say, here are the foods that contain inulin, which is a fermentable form of fiber, that produces butyrate. And they'll say Jerusalem artichokes and, things of this variety. We don't have to do that. We actually don't have to do that. We can keep this super simple. All plants contain fiber. All plants contain fiber. Now, not every single form of fiber is fermentable. Not every single form of fiber preferentially translates into more butyrate. But if you are consuming more plants, no matter what plant it is, I can assure you there is fiber content there. And that fiber content some of it is going to be fermentable fiber that's able to feed and nourish these gut microbes. So, and of course the resistant starch, I don't want to leave out the resistant starch because actually there's some studies that suggest that resistant starch is preferentially, if you're asking me what is the one, I might actually say resistant starch is the answer, not even fiber.
Wow. Okay.
Because there are some studies that say that preferentially resistant starch is transformed into butyrate. And so that's a cool thing. And you can get resistant starch from potatoes and green bananas and legumes.
So green bananas, legumes, and white potatoes, sweet potatoes, would they be in there as resistant starch, or
More
just
so,
white potatoes?
believe it or not, more so white potatoes than sweet potatoes. This is where I always come to defense of potatoes. Look, I'm not here. I do like potato chips. I think we all do. They're crispy. I do enjoy that. But I'm not here to defend French fries and chips. In the States we call them chips. It's crisps, right? In the UK? Okay.
Yeah, it's crisps.
Fair enough. So I'm just trying to translate here. But look, I'm not here to defend those things. But sometimes I think that we are going too far in our attack on the potato. We shouldn't just eat a potato diet, but there are beneficial properties in potatoes. And one of the things that you can do is when you heat up your potatoes, such as making mashed potatoes, and you let it cool down, that process of cooling down after you heat it reconstitutes the starch. And when it comes back together, it forms resistant starch. And so it's this cool process where you can heat up, cool, and in doing so, create resistant starch for yourself.
Recent studies in the UK have shown a concerning trend. Nearly a third of Britons suffer with insomnia or severe sleep disturbances, with stress, screens, and sleep hygiene largely to blame. This isn't just about feeling groggy in the morning. The NHS has linked poor sleep with a high risk in chronic conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and not to mention the impact on poor mental health. That's why I'm excited to share with you my experience with Natromat, a company that truly understands the science of sleep. Crafted in Devon with its organic, renewable materials, Natromat mattresses are a testament to what it means to sleep naturally. Unlike the common mattresses that trap heat and moisture, Natromat's use of organic wool and coconut fibre ensures your body remains at a comfortable temperature throughout the night, promoting a more deeper, restorative night's sleep. But what really sets Natromat apart is their commitment to sustainability. As the UK's first B Corp certified bed and mattress company, they're not just talking about environmental responsibility, they're living it. From their solar-powered workshops to their groundbreaking Mattress for Life initiative, choosing Natromat is a choice for a healthier planet. I personally visited Natromat's showroom in Chiswick and I was amazed at their sleep zone. It's designed to give you a real sense of how their mattresses can transform your sleep. The calming ambience, the bespoke sleep aroma, and the privacy to truly relax and feel the difference. It's an experience that I would recommend to anyone who is serious about improving their sleep quality. For my UK listeners looking to transform their sleep and by extension their health, I encourage you to visit natromat.co.uk. And don't forget, being a Live Well Be Well listener, you can get 10% off your first order using the code LIVEWELL. Invest in your sleep, your health, and your planet with Natromat. And is that the same as pasta? Because I've heard that with pasta as well, with resistant starch. If people have pasta.
Any starchy food, you can do this. So it's most notable though with potatoes. But yes, think about the mashed potato. Does the mashed potato taste different after you've cooked it and then cooled it compared to the warm potato? I would argue that it does. Does the bean taste a little different after you've cooked it and let it cool compared to when it's warm? I would argue that it does. And so you see these things. It's quite interesting how there's this gift that exists in nature where the starch can reconstitute in a way that's actually beneficial to our gut microbes.
I mean, it's quite amazing, isn't it? And I'm just thinking about this in terms of a lot of people mentioned before when we were talking about fiber, and we didn't talk about resistant starch. We're thinking about these foods that are high in resistant starch and these foods that are high in fiber or plant compounds. Lots of people get worried about IBS, IBD symptoms and having a huge load of fiber. But obviously what we're saying is this is really important for our gut barrier to reduce inflammation, to help, support and reduce disease. What do you say to those people that are listening that might struggle to have fiber? What's the answer for them?
So first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this issue because sometimes in nature, things are nuanced. This is an example. Sometimes it's not so completely straightforward and linear at all times. And there was a book that came out a few years ago that I'm personally not a fan of called The Plant Paradox. And I would argue this is the true plant paradox. This is the true plant paradox because the paradox is that the people who need fiber the most, these people with IBS and inflammatory bowel disease, are the people who will also struggle the most to introduce fiber into their diet. So I would like to unpack this for a moment and then explain the path forward. So first of all, I am not here to say that everyone should take their diet and add 30 grams of fiber today. That's a bad choice for pretty much all of us. The thing about fiber, and we can include resistant starch if we want. Resistant starch tends to be a little more gentle. But the thing about fiber is that the human digestive system does not have the ability to digest fiber. It's the microbes, right? So the microbes produce the enzymes. So what is the case if you have a microbiome that hasn't been processing fiber, that lacks the enzymes to digest and process the fiber? What happens when it's January 1st and you radically transform your diet and you go 100% whole food plant-based all at once? You will be miserable. And the reason why is because of the mismatch between the digestive capacity of your microbiome and what you're putting into your mouth and swallowing. Your gut microbiome has been trained already. Like all of us, we have a trained microbiome. It's been trained to whatever you've been eating in the last 2 months. So to make a dietary change, we have to allow the opportunity for adaptation. Because as you add high fiber foods to your diet, it's not that you lack the microbes and they can never be grown. It's that those microbes are not properly represented because that's not what you've been eating. When you add fiber to your diet, you will start to get those microbes represented. Now, you could go hard and ramp up your fiber aggressively and you will be miserable. But at some point, it will get better because the microbes will catch up. Flip side, that's not what I'm advocating for. Sometimes I think people think that they hear me say that. No. I have a saying that I've been pounding this drum for many years now. I have a saying, low and slow is the tempo.
Love that.
Now, conveniently, I grew up in the 80s, and this is a Beastie Boys song. All right. So when I was a kid, low and slow is the tempo. I was like, I'm waiting for the school bus. Low and slow is the tempo. All right. So this is a Beastie Boys song, but it's also the way that we should approach introducing fiber and plant-based foods to our diet. Because the gut conceptually is like a muscle. It can be trained. It can be made stronger. A person who has IBS or particularly inflammatory bowel disease, that muscle is not strong. I promise you, it is not. In fact, that muscle needs to be rehabbed. Not just made stronger. It needs to be rehabbed. And the way that we rehab a muscle is by starting with what you're actually capable of doing. And over time, slowly increasing that. and doing more. And so low and slow is the tempo basically means that you start with where you are today and you gently add a little bit more over time. And by doing it slowly and gently and backing down if you need to, because you're starting to get bloated or other digestive symptoms, by doing it that way, your gut, you're giving it the time to catch up. You're giving it the time to adapt. You're bringing forward the microbes that will help you to process and digest these food. You are capable. This is the message of hope and optimism. You are capable of having a healthy gut. We all are capable of having a healthy gut. You're not stuck. But the issue is that you need to rehab your gut. And you need to start with where it is today, which may be more of a challenge, and then gently ease it up. And what you will discover is that you will start to become capable of processing this food without any symptoms, without any bloating. Next thing you know, this is a powerful part of your diet and you're thriving and feeling the best that you've ever felt. And that IBS, or that inflammatory bowel disease, it's, to be clear, impossible to cure. You can't cure it. But if you put it into remission, where you are no longer having symptoms, and if you have an inflammatory bowel, no longer having flares, if that's where you get to, and it never turns back because you have made some change to your diet that allows you to accomplish this, that's effectively a cure. A permanent remission is the same.
So because you're a gastroenterologist, and I'm just thinking, if somebody came in with IBS or IBD to see you, some gastroenterologists, and I don't know if you would do this, would say go on an exclusion diet or start stripping back loads of foods. And what I hear you say is, don't be scared of these foods, introduce them slowly. And I think there's this like very foggy landscape where people are so confused about what is hurting their gut that they either become quite scared of food and they totally strip it out of their diet until they've stopped having symptoms, which can massively reduce their intake of nutrients, but they're not in pain. Or they feel so overwhelmed that they don't know where to start and they carry on with these symptoms. Yeah. So what would be your take on how you would then advise somebody? What would you do if somebody came in with those symptoms to you?
Well, so I've dealt with this scenario a bazillion times, because irritable bowel syndrome is the most common diagnosis that exists in a gastrologist practice. And so there are a few things here. First of all, I can't speak for the entirety of all gastroenterologists across the globe. There's millions. There's millions of gastroenterologists. And with the internet and social media, you will find someone who will advocate for everything. Yeah. Right? So if you have some sort of bias and want to fulfill that bias, you will find someone in another country somewhere in the world that says that, and 99.999% of their peers may say that person is insane, and we completely disagree. And yet, if that's what you want to hear, you'll call that person a genius. And that's the world that we live in. The evidence, first of all, with regard to fiber and these conditions is clear. It's clear. People who introduce fiber into their diet, increase the fiber in their diet, this leads to better health outcomes. There's no dietary guidelines that are advising people to eliminate fiber from their diet. Temporary is a totally different thing. Temporary is part of a process. Permanent elimination, permanent restriction, that does not exist aside from people who have specific medical conditions, like celiac disease. It's a totally different thing. Like you can't take celiac disease and then generalize that out to other people who don't have celiac disease. So now when we look at like what happens in the gut microbiome when people reduce diversity within their diet, we have a number of different studies where this is the case. People may be following a gluten-free diet. And again, like if you have celiac disease, you should, but people may be following a gluten-free diet. People may be eliminating FODMAPs from their diet. And when people make these choices consistently, the gut microbiome appears less healthy in our studies. So regardless of the dietary pattern, dietary patterns of restriction and exclusion are not the optimal long-term approach. It's clear that diversity and abundance is actually the way forward. Now, sometimes we will take one step backward so that we can take two steps forward. And that's part of the process that I describe in my second book, which was the Fibre Fuelled cookbook. In the Fibre Fuelled cookbook, one of the things that I'm proud of is that the book was made for people who have this exact issue, Sarah. People that have irritable bowel syndrome or are struggling to add more plant-based foods to their diet, because I want to help you accomplish that, because clearly I wholeheartedly believe in this. And so what I did is I put 2 dietary protocols in there, basically like just eat the recipes that are in the book, read the chapter, eat the recipes, and it will help you sort this out. So the 2 that are in there are FODMAPs, a low FODMAP diet, and histamines, a low histamine diet. And these are things where you might actually temporarily eliminate these things like FODMAPs and histamines, go low FODMAP, low histamine. And that's a diagnostic process. That's temporary. You're going to bring it back on board. The other thing I would say real quick is the days of a one-stop shop for healthcare are gone. And so if you go to your doctor expecting your doctor to be all things all at once, that's a mistake. You need to build a team. And when it comes to nutrition, that team should include a person who's adequately qualified to talk to you about nutrition, which to me is a registered dietitian.
I think that's really important, right? Having the support, but also having the time to do this and making sure that you're actually setting out time where you are doing this properly is probably one of the biggest key factors to helping understand your gut health. And something that it was a personal story for me, which actually when I was 16, and you've mentioned, and I'm saying this because you mentioned earlier about our immune system being kind of located within our gut, and obviously with the gut barrier, if it's permeated and it can kind of seep through into our bloodstreams, that's a cause of concern and dysbiosis. So I had glandular fever when I was 16, and that somehow caused a huge load of gut problems for me. What's the link with autoimmune conditions and gut health? Because I think that's a really unspoken area, or something that I haven't heard people speak about much on podcasts. But I think there's such a big interlink between these two. And people that suffer with autoimmune conditions, should they be focusing on their gut health? That's something that I think is a really critical question.
When I was writing Fibre Fuelled, and I was doing most of the writing in the year 2019. The book came out in 2020, but I was doing most of the writing in the year 2019. I sat down and I asked the question, are autoimmune diseases associated with damage to the gut microbiome? The word is dysbiosis, as you mentioned a moment ago. Are autoimmune diseases associated with dysbiosis? And I created a list of autoimmune diseases, and I started to go through, by the way, allergic diseases as well. I started to go through and take a look at the research. And what I discovered is that I could not find a study in which people had an autoimmune or allergic type health condition, and when they tested the gut microbiome, it appeared normal or healthy. Every single study looking at the gut microbiome, if you lift up the hood and take a look at what's happening on the inside in a person who has these health conditions, every single study that I looked at showed me that there was disease or damage to the gut microbiome. That's the starting point of the conversation. But when you go further, because I think back in 2019, we were thinking more about the gut microbes and had not yet extended the conversation into the gut barrier. But as you extend the conversation into the gut barrier, it's no surprise that you will discover as well, consistently, that there's evidence of increased intestinal permeability. Basically intending or meaning that the gut barrier is not properly doing its job. Things are getting across. And this leads to activation of the immune system. Now, I am not here to pretend that the only thing that matters for gut health that the only thing that matters for autoimmune diseases or chronic inflammatory diseases is your gut. That's not the case. But that being said, you can take the microbiome of a person who has ulcerative colitis and perform a fecal transplant into an animal and transfer the health condition. So there are clearly other elements to this story. There's a genetic element that exists. But clearly the rise, like in many cases, a 500% increase or more in many of these autoimmune conditions, the rise of these autoimmune diseases in recent years, that is not a shift in our genetics. Our genetics don't change that quickly. That is a change in the environment. And I believe the effect that our environment is having on our gut microbiome, what we accept as normal in 2024 was not normal 100 years ago.
And are you talking that in the context of like our food environment, such as ultra processed foods? Are you talking that in the sense of stress and the chronic stress that we live in, the reduced physical activities, all of these factors that you think are kind of harming our gut microbiome and the permeability and the dysbiosis?
Sarah Ann, you're making this very easy for me because you're listing all these things and all I have to do is say yes. And you could, I'm sure, could keep going. All right.
I could keep going.
The interesting thing about this is that I want our listeners to conceptualize this for a moment. Living inside of you is this ecosystem, right? It's microscopic, so it's not visible to the naked eye, which makes it seem like it doesn't exist, but it's there. It exists. It's an entire ecosystem that's alive. And not to give you a God complex, people say that sometimes doctors have a God complex, but not to give the listeners a God complex, but actually you, in a way, get to play God because you make choices with the way that you live your life that actually shape this environment. The top choice being the food that you put into your mouth. So we consume on average more than a kilo of food, more than roughly 3 pounds of food per day, per person. And that's coming into contact with these microbes, and that shapes the environment. The rise and fall of families are determined based upon those choices that you make, but it's not just food. It's not just food. That the way in which we sleep and exercise and move and our mood and things that happen to us, traumatic events in our lives. So as a quick example, I've had many patients, actually, I've said this before on other shows, that for me, the greatest, most satisfying moments as a physician have not been the person that I've encouraged them to eat more fiber, although it is amazing to watch them transform their lives and their health. But actually, the most satisfying moments have been when I have the person who's coming to me for a 5th or a 6th opinion. They've been to every doctor in town and doctors outside of town. And they are doing everything right. Eating the proper diet, sleep, exercise. It's by the book. And what you often discover is that there is some sort of unresolved trauma from their past, whether it be childhood or as an adult. There's something that happened, and they may not be consciously thinking of it, but it's unresolved and it continues to fester and exist in their subconscious. So when we have stress leads to activation of our sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is adrenaline. We call it fight or flight, basically meaning that like if you were getting attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, you're either going to try to fight that thing and you get charged up to do it, right? Or you're going to like run so fast and climb a tree. But like your athletic ability in that moment is actually superior to what it normally is because your sympathetic nervous system has been charged up and activated. Right? You're superhuman. The problem is like that's intended for that acute situation, and that's not the way that we live in 2024 in many cases. And for people who have unresolved trauma, there's continuous activation of that sympathetic nervous system. And when this happens, there's a consequence. Many of us, during times of stress, we manifest it in our gut. I'm quite sure that almost all the listeners can relate to this. You have to go give you're nervous about public speaking. And you're about to go up on stage. What's going on in your tummy in that moment? Probably something on the spectrum of, at a minimum, butterflies, flutters, possibly something more intense, possibly nausea, possibly discomfort, possibly intense cramping pain, possibly diarrhea. That is the manifestation of stress in our gut acutely. And it's illustrating what I'm about to tell you is happening physiologically inside your body, which is that in these times of stress, with activation of the sympathetic nervous system, our brain releases a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, which sets off the stress response and its entire cascade of things that come from this. It spreads out and becomes a series of things within the body. But the consequence of this spreading out of this stress response, like there are benefits when we need it. Right? But the consequence is negative harm done to the gut microbes. So in a way, this person who has this traumatic event that happens to them that they haven't properly addressed They're doing everything right, and they're like a rocket ship that has been chained to the ground and can't lift off. Because although they're doing everything right, this thing is holding them back.
Mm-hmm.
And when you bring their attention to this thing, and I am not the person who actually does the therapy or does the treatment for this, I am a gastroenterologist. But what I do is I help them connect the dots and see that this is the source of their problem. And in that moment, what happens is they get the treatment that they need for that specific issue. You're breaking that chain, and that is a rocket ship. And then you watch that person fly, and it is the most beautiful and exciting thing, and you're just clapping, and you're like, this is incredible. So, and this is the way that it works with some people, is that it's not just whether or not you eat fiber, whether or not you sleep and exercise, that there is more complexity to it.
I mean, your body, your mind and body are connected. And I'm such a true believer in trauma that lives in the body. And personally, I've said this before on the podcast, but I've suffered with my stomach since I was 16. And I know that it's been because I've held trauma in my body since that moment. And that's why I'm such a big believer of the mind and body interconnection and the vagus nerve and everything that it does with its kind of transformative power of telling the gut and the mind what's going on. And Gabor Mate speaks about this so well, about how your trauma is stored and how stress is manifested in the body, and why are autoimmune conditions on the rise? Potentially because of trauma.
I totally agree. I mean, part of it is dietary shifts, but I don't think it's exclusively that. I think that there's also these other things that exist.
Completely. And we even had Dr. Marielle Bouquet on recently, and she spoke about intergenerational trauma. And that opened a whole new can of worms, because there's so much unconscious trauma that we could be hiding within ourselves. And it's interesting, a lot of people do things by the book and have this unresolved question: why am I still in this state?
Yeah, and I also think that there's new things that have changed that we have completely normalized very, very, very quickly. That depending on when you were born, you may have grown up this way, but like I was born in 1980 and I did not grow up this way. Things were quite different when I was a kid in the 80s. And an example of this would be social media. So like, look, social media serves a purpose. I have a large account. I'm grateful for the opportunities that has brought to my life, but I also hate it. I also hate it. And I hate it particularly for the developing brain. The young person that is on average in the United States right now, spending 5.5 hours per day online. And the way that they think, the way that those neurons fire is being formed by this. And it's not a coincidence, Sarah Ann, that there's data that exists showing that depression rates have risen profoundly, particularly among young people, since 2011. 2011, it was October of 2010, actually, that Instagram started. And
I remember.
I didn't sign up until 2016. But anyway, and the other thing that happened around then is the front-facing camera. So that you could take a selfie. And so now people are posting pictures of themselves and their idealized life on the internet. And for vulnerable minds that are forming, going through a major restructuring of the brain during those teenage years, this is it's a dangerous thing. And I think it's created a lot of issues.
I could not agree more with that. And I think there's a line of obsession that comes with the phone as well, and the dopamine hits and everything. So there's that kind of need of addiction that comes in line. And again, what that creates is stress and uncertainty and everything you just said about fight and flight. And so the activation starts again. And so, the gut becomes activated from all of these hits and addictions and obsessions around, needing to feel wanted, or whatever that is, that message that's coming through on the phone. It's such a bigger conversation that, when we talk about anything, I think it's just not isolated. It's all interconnected. But something that I really wanted to touch upon, when I started practicing on Harley Street about 7 years ago now, people started talking about leaky gut. And I say, anyone who's not watching on YouTube with like quotation marks. But now SIBO has become quite a big topic of conversation. And I remember it being quite a new thing back then that people were talking about. But first of all, I think it's quite an unexplained area for many people. And we've never spoke about it on the show before, even when we've done gut health issues. So can you first explain what is SIBO to everyone listening? Because I think it really links to kind of our first conversation.
So SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. This is
so much better.
Oh, no worries. This is what happens when you're talking about these topics literally all day long. But this is something that, first of all, it's real, but also it's not super satisfying because people want it to be something that's concretely and firmly established as this is what it is, this is how you treat it, this is how to improve it. And I feel like that cake is half-baked. When you take a half-baked cake out of the oven, it's a sloppy mess. And I feel like when we're rushing to make SIBO into a thing, we're not ready for it. And it's a bit of a sloppy mess. So let's talk through what this is. So small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Okay. There are microbes throughout your intestines. So there's no part that's completely sterile. Even your stomach has microbes. It's just that the stomach has quite few because of stomach acid. And there's this gradient that exists, whereas you move further and further down into the intestines, the number of microbes increases. And then it pops and explodes in terms of a lot more microbes when you get to the large intestine, which is the colon. This is where the vast majority of these microbes exist, in the colon. All right. And when they're in balance and harmony, this is the way that it works. But when things fall out of balance, which again, the word that we use is dysbiosis, then you can have things occurring in places that they're not supposed to be. And that includes microbes infiltrating the small intestine. So bacteria that are now existing within the small intestine, growing, multiplying, coming into contact with your food. But not supposed to be there, not supposed to be doing that the way that they're doing that. And creating disruption and issues for people, commonly causing bloating, with bloating and gas, potentially discomfort. And classic SIBO is associated with diarrhea. Now, there are some forms of SIBO, like there are multiple forms of SIBO. Again, like I feel like this is quite half-baked. But there are some forms of SIBO that are also associated with constipation. And I would like to talk about them in a moment, if I could.
Yeah.
But to me, starting with to me as a gastroenterologist, when I think of SIBO, I'm thinking about an overgrowth of bacteria within the small intestine that's associated with bloating, discomfort, and diarrhea. And that is treatable potentially with antibiotics. Now, here's the problem. Let's stop for a quick moment. And I want to point out first that the testing that has been used in the vast majority of studies, and that's also predominantly used in the clinic to diagnose SIBO, is wildly flawed. Wildly flawed. Like literally in some cases could be a 50% accuracy rate.
Are you talking about the breath thing?
The breath test. Yes.
I thought you might. Yeah.
Yes. So, and this is what most people use because it's convenient, it's not invasive, it's easy. But the problem is that there are a number of different things that can give you a false positive. There's a number of different things that can give you a false negative. It's hard to have great confidence in this test. If you have SIBO, let's pretend you truly have SIBO, but the test comes back negative. You're not going to get the treatment that you need. And if you don't have SIBO, but you get a false positive, you are likely to be inappropriately treated with antibiotics, which is actually going to set you back and make you worse. So there's a testing problem. The gold standard test, there's always a gold standard test. The gold standard test is what we call sterile jejunal aspirate. So basically what's happening here is the person gets an upper endoscopy. So it's an invasive procedure. You have to put someone to sleep. A gastroenterologist like myself will go down into their small intestine through their mouth. And then using special sterile technique, because if you disrupt the sterile technique, you throw off the entire thing. Using sterile technique, you get a sample of fluid and you check to see how many bacteria grow in that sample. All right. So now this is the gold standard test. The problem is, first of all, no one does this. I've done 0 in my career. And if you were to go and bring 25 new additional gastroenterologists on the show, I'd be shocked if more than one says they've ever done one.
Wow.
It's never done.
Because I hadn't heard of it. So when you said it, I thought, how do I not know this procedure? Because
so this is the gold standard
test,
but no one actually does it. No one actually does it. Even at academic centers, they don't do this.
Why? Because it's just so, because people have endoscopies to see if they've got celiac disease, or a colonoscopy to see if they've got, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. Why does no one do this to see if there's SIBO?
Because you require, there's the fact that it has to be sterile. There's special techniques that you have to use in order to get a proper sample. You have to go a little bit further down. So the jejunum is the second part of the small intestine. It's not the first part of the small intestine. It's the second part. And that's not actually that easy to get access to. It's quite hard. So all of these things are barriers to the use of this test. But then there's this other thing, Sarah, which there was a paper that came out, I think in 2019, in Nature Communications, where they looked at this gold standard test and basically showed that the gold standard test is flawed. That, like, for example, you could be a high fiber consumer like myself. And because you consume fiber, you could get a false positive on the gold standard test just because you consume fiber. And on the flip side, you could have raging dysbiosis of the small intestine, and the gold standard test is normal. So in other words, even the gold standard test is not truly a gold standard. So this is where, like, we have a problem with this. We can't properly test for the condition. The second issue is that people often rush to do treatment for SIBO with antibiotics. And if the problem is dysbiosis, we know that the quickest way to actually introduce dysbiosis to a human is with antibiotics. Like, if you're trying to medically induce, if my goal was to give a person dysbiosis, I would give them an antibiotic. So we're not fixing the problem by destroying. The scorched earth strategy is not going to work here. The way that we fix the problem is by building, empowering the good guys. Because when we restore eubiosis, which is the healthy, balanced microbiome, it takes care of itself. It's just that requires time, effort, and may not be easy because these are the people that add fiber to their diet and they don't feel well. But in that Nature Communications study that basically made it appear that the gold standard test is wildly flawed, they found that the people who did the worst, they actually added a little pilot study of humans to this, and they found that the people who did the worst were those who were consuming a high sugar diet, refined sugar, and the people who received antibiotics. And the people who did the best were the people who were adding fiber. So even though it's hard, I think that that's the solution to this particular issue. Again, it's a bit complex. I actually so I'm a regular on the Zoe Science and Nutrition podcast, and this is one of the topics that we have covered. And we covered it, like, I could literally teach for 3 hours on this topic, so it's hard for me to get it down to like a couple moments. But anyway, for those who want to do a little bit deeper than what we just discussed, there is a Zoe Science and Nutrition podcast on that topic they could check out.
So I guess for anyone who maybe has just heard of SIBO for the first time on this show, or maybe heard of it in the past, but are also just overwhelmed where they don't want to go and get a test that isn't accurate and spend that money, your advice would be to not potentially get antibiotics, to actually start introducing more diversity into your diet. Is that the kind of best management strategy for somebody who may relate to the symptoms that you just said?
All right, so I would branch it into 2 specific groups of people, because in order to believe that you have SIBO, you clearly have chronic digestive symptoms. You have to. So, and you likely have either diarrhea or constipation.
Which can be really confused with IBS.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this whole thing is quite confusing with IBS because there are some people who believe this is not universally accepted, but there are some people who believe that most IBS is actually SIBO. I would argue that all IBS is dysbiosis, meaning that the colon microbiome is out of balance, and that some people have also dysbiosis within their small intestine as well. Okay. That would be my argument. But anyway, all right. So let's separate people. You have diarrhea or you have constipation. There are many people who they're constipated, they're bloated, they get a SIBO breath test. It's positive, and they think they have SIBO, and they go to take antibiotics, and they don't feel any better. That's because the issue is constipation. Right. And the way that you fix this is by addressing the bowel regularity. If I could take that person and work with them, and there's not one single solution. Constipation requires working with a trained expert who can help you find the right thing. But if I could get them into a rhythm where they're having good, regular, complete evacuations, that's my way of saying a great dump. If I could get them to that place,
yeah,
actually, all these issues, particularly the bloating, it would all go away. It would all go away if we could just get them into a better rhythm. So you don't need the antibiotics. You just need to be on a plan that's going to help you address the constipation. When you fix the constipation, you will fix the issue. Flip side, diarrhea. The person has diarrhea. From my perspective as a gastroenterologist, that is not the diagnosis. Right? It is not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is we have to ask the question, why? Why does this person have diarrhea? The diagnosis might be irritable bowel syndrome. It could be SIBO. But let's not let go of the fact that there are many things that cause diarrhea. That would include celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease, but also less scary things like microscopic colitis. So there are many potential causes of diarrhea. You have to start with making the diagnosis. That's, to me, where we have to begin. So there's not some universal solution to this. It's not simply add more fiber to your diet. Fiber may be part of the plan. Fiber does help many of the conditions that I just mentioned. It may be part of the plan, but it's not the plan. It needs to be that you first make the diagnosis, understand what you're actually treating, and then you take it from there. So now, are there people that I will treat with antibiotics? Yes, but not many. Surprisingly, not many. If for every 100 people who says, I think I have SIBO and I want to take an antibiotic, I probably chop that down to maybe 2 who end up on antibiotics on the back end. It's about making the diagnosis, make the proper diagnosis, and then treat whatever it is that you've just diagnosed, as opposed to loading a person up with antibiotics on the first visit and discovering that it really didn't fix anything.
Honestly, it's one of the biggest things, I think, for any intervention when it comes to health, whether it's mental health, whether it's gastro health, that actually trying to fix the problem as opposed to use medication to kind of numb what's going on. Yep. There's always, I think, as you know, a placement for medication and treatment in that place, always. But so many times we kind of miss the solution. And I think the thing that I've seen, and I know you would have, because I mean, you've been doing this for years, is that people then just get quite scared of food. People feel like this is now going to harm me, and they eliminate it. And so much of this conversation has been, actually, that's ultimately the cure. Actually kind of reintroducing this is actually the cure to it. And I think that is why, as I'm just like listening to this, you're just reaffirming every time, go back to the food, go back to the food. But I think we've got into this narrative, especially in the UK, of reduce that food if it hurts, take it out, take it out, take it out, and keep it out. And so then when people start having less symptoms, they don't want to kind of reintroduce that back in again. But so much of this conversation has actually been, don't fear that food, which I think is a really important take-home message.
So I completely agree. And I'm not advocating that people inflict harm on their body and be in pain, like crippling pain. Like, obviously I have tremendous sympathy for this. And 10 years ago, I was in that place myself. What I believe is that the gut is highly adaptable. And no matter where you are today, there is the opportunity that exists to have a better tomorrow. And it's just a process that we have to work through. And I would make an analogy, Sarah Ann, with this to, let's imagine for a moment that you hurt your knee. All right. So with this hurt knee, one of the things that you could do is you could go plop on the couch and never get up. And if you do that, you will not feel any pain. If you never put weight on that knee, you will not feel any pain. But the problem is that there are other consequences that you will suffer as a result of the decision to just go and sit on the couch for the rest of your life. Obviously, you will fall out of metabolic balance. And next thing you know, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, weight gain,
Depression.
increase your risk of, right, depression, right? Like there's so many, you go down the line, there's so many different things. And this is not the choice that any rational or reasonable person would ever make. Because you know that the path forward is to rehabilitate that knee. And the process of rehabilitation is working with an expert to start low and go slow in terms of exercise. So you don't immediately start running. You start with what you're actually capable of doing, and you do push your body a little bit. And in the process of pushing your body a little bit, there may be moments in time where you cross that threshold where you feel some discomfort. But it's being managed, right? You're not going so hard that you're just throwing caution to the wind and you're in pain with a horrible knee that's swollen. You're doing just enough to continue to restore function to that knee. And that process that you invest into, that every single person does, because this is just completely accepted as the treatment for a bum knee. That process that you go through is worth the discomfort and what you have to do, the effort that's required to put you on the other side where you have restored function to your knee, and now you're back to skiing, or for me, playing basketball, or playing pickleball, or whatever it is that you enjoy. You can get back to that, right? If you lay on the couch, you're never going to do that again. So with me, like, I want us to think about our food in the same regard. The gut may be broken right now. It can be rehabilitated. You can restore function. That process of restoring function is starting low and going slow. During the process of starting low and going slow, you may at times feel a little bit of discomfort, and it does require effort, but it's worth it. Because when you emerge on the other side, you have restored function to your gut, and now you are a healthier person who is thriving and you are able to consume food without fear, without restriction as a result of what you just did.
I think that analogy of a knee is such a nice one, actually, because I've gone through so many times with the painful physio thinking, this is not going to get better. And it does, but it takes 6 months.
Yeah.
And it's similar to gut health. But what's also really, really hopeful is how we started this, of saying, even within 20 minutes, you can start making changes. And so you can see things start changing, maybe small, but they will change. And it might not take 6 months. I think that's just a really nice, hopeful thing, because I think a lot of people can feel very hopeless in this situation. And it takes me to like my next kind of question around, which I don't think many people talk about, but it's burping and belching. And many people I know can suffer with this quite a lot and can feel really embarrassed, but don't actually know how to control it. So what's your advice around people that are burping? Because there's obviously something happening, but I don't think people really know how to approach it.
Yeah. Okay. So many people believe that when they are belching, it is the result of, something that's going on with the microbiome or the colon or things of this variety. And you have to understand that's on the distal opposite end of your intestines. Like that is like, 8 meters downstream relative to the top. And the air that you belch up typically has very little smell or smells like whatever's in your stomach. The air, in order to belch, has to enter into your body somehow. There are specific ways in which it can sneak in without you even realizing it. So it's important to bring attention to these specific things. Some may seem quite obvious, but in the moment when you're belching, it's like, sometimes we just need this obvious list. So you can go, okay, check, not that, check, not that. One is carbonated drinks. Naturally, anyone who's got a belching issue, eliminate carbonated drinks. 2, sipping through straws. Next time you have a straw in a beverage, what I want you to do is take a look at what's inside the length of that straw. And I'm going to tell you what you're going to find. There's a water level that exists wherever the straw enters into the water. So everything below that will be liquid, but everything above that will be air. When you sip through a straw, you wrap your lips around this, you create a seal, and that vacuum effect allows you to draw in through there. Whatever was above the water level, you have now just swallowed. That's air. Okay. Chewing gum, sucking on candies. When we do this, we salivate. And when we salivate, we swallow more. And when we swallow more, we swallow more air. And this can lead to belching. All right. So these are some of the things that people need to be aware of, that like if you have an issue with belching, get rid of the gum or like sucking on candy, get rid of the carbonated drinks, stop sipping through straws. Like this is step 1. There is this condition that, and it's like, it's a complex conversation to have with a person. Like I have to like gently introduce this idea because people tend to get defensive because they feel almost as if you're accusing them of doing this to themselves, which they clearly are not doing. They're asking for help. But this condition is called aerophagia. And aerophagia basically means that you are swallowing air repeatedly. So think about the kid who, I was never that great at this, but I had friends who could do the entire alphabet with belching, right? So they could go A, B, C, D, but they're like doing it with burps. How does a person do that? Well, the way in which they do that is every single burp, they are swallowing air right before they bring it right back up on the belch. And this is what's happening on aerophagia, is that a person is not conscious or aware that they're swallowing air repeatedly. But if you actually pay attention to what this person may be doing, like for example, they'll be in the clinic and they'll be belching, and I'll watch, I'll like discreetly watch, and I'll see that right before they belch, you can see their Adam's apple, if it's a guy, move because they just swallowed. So they bring the air down. In many cases, that air never even gets into the stomach. It just gets into the esophagus, and then they bring it back up. So the solution to this issue, if you're the person who's belching multiple times per hour, the solution to this issue is first to diagnose the aerophagia. And treatment can include working with a speech therapist. It may also, believe it or not, include working with what are called, what we describe as centrally acting agents. So like basically these are like antidepressants, but you're just using them for a different purpose and at a different dose. So like one that I've had great success in my patients who have this issue is called buspirone. And like if you give a person buspirone at 45 or 60 milligrams per day, it can be used to treat depression. But like for me, I would give it to them at 10 or 15 milligrams a day. So like a very, very small dose. And that would be enough to help to actually break this cycle of swallowing air and then bringing it back up.
Wow. Fascinating. I love how there's so many different types of treatment options for one medication, but just used in different doses. And I think that's something that's it's just quite fascinating. I think a lot of people can struggle with this problem, but would never have thought that that could be an option for them. And sadly, it can be a very embarrassing, condition that people can suffer from and never seek help. So I'm really glad that we approached that actually, because so many times we can focus on IBS and IBD and the stomach and what does our poo look like and what's a healthy poo, but so rarely do we speak about that. And so The last question that I want to leave with, which I ask all of my guests, and I've asked you last time, and I should have gone back and I should have looked at what your answer was because I cannot remember, but I'm going to find out and see if it was the same. But the irony of when people come back on the show, 95% of the time, they say the different answer, which I think is the beauty of this question. I don't know if you remember it, but it's Dr. Will Bulsiewicz, what does live well, be well mean to you?
Oh man, I think I remember what I said, so I'm gonna try to be at least slightly different in my answer, and I'll just share with you, Sarah Ann, what I think about, which is that we've added to our family since the last time I was on the show. So I now have 4 children, and I think I'm just now in this phase where I'm all in on being a dad. And to me, live well, be well is. So I think about like our family and what we're imperfect, but we are trying to create a culture within our family of support and love, and knowing that you are connected to this group of people that will always be there for you no matter what. And they will lift you up, and they will defend you, and they will work to protect you. And all of these things, this is what we are as a family. We stick together. And to me, live well, be well is an extension of that. We as humans are social creatures. We were meant to be connected to other humans. We actually get miserably depressed when we get isolated. Social media is actually quite isolating. I call it social. It's actually antisocial.
Totally.
And to me, live well, be well is stepping away from technology for a moment and getting back to these basic things of human connection, looking people in the eyes, and getting to know one another and caring about one another. Like, to me, this is the world that I want to live in. This is the world I want my children to live in. And I think this is the world that we all deserve to live in.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's such a beautiful answer. The fact that it's true, right? Knowing that you're a team. I think that's a really beautiful knowing answer, that you can lift each other up. And I think that is the importance of human connection, that it's not meant to be solo. So that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And please tell everyone where your 2 bestseller books people can buy from and what they are, so people can go ahead and buy your cookbook and also your other book, Fibre Fuelled.
Yeah, my first book was Fibre Fuelled. I managed to write a book where both of the words in the title are spelled differently in the UK than they are in the US. So so with appropriate British spelling, you can find this book and the Fibre Fuelled cookbook in wherever books are sold in the UK, or if you're in the United States and listening, you can find it anywhere that books are sold in the US as well. I personally am a fan. I mean, I realize that like 95% of books, at least in the States, are sold on Amazon.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I get it. But I also am a fan of trying to support your local bookstore. And I say this all the time because the family that owns that local bookstore, like, you actually buying a book helps them to continue that business. And I don't want the days of me being able to mosey into a bookstore and browse and have a cup of coffee. Like, I don't want those days to ever go away. So let's continue to support our local bookstore owners who live in our community whenever possible.
I agree. Thank you so much, Will, for coming on the show. And I'm hoping next time we do this, we can do it in person.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll have to do that, Sarah Ann. Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun.
Thank you.